Hello and welcome to Crimillusion.com. This is Stephen Burns, and we'll give you a little bit of an insight into photomatics and HDR. And what you're looking at here is a shot that I photographed on my way to Death Valley. And as you can see here, we have extreme ranges of values here, extreme highlights, as well as the shadow details as well being extreme. So if I expose for the shadows, which I've done in this shot, the highlights are going to blow out. If I expose for the highlights, as I've done in this particular shot, then of course I've sacrificed detail in my shadow areas. Keep in mind that HDR is a way to take this extreme range of information and to allow you to massage it into something much more palatable to your personal vision. Now, what we're doing is we're compensating for the shadows in this example, the highlights in this one, and a third image was photographed so that we can capture the mid-tone information. Now, as you notice here, these are TIFF files, which means they're formatted. Now, the new Photomatics 3.2.9 allows us to, has a special feature that will allow you to utilize formatted images. Normally, we're using raw files, which is basically your raw ones and zero data. In other words, your unformatted information. So let's go into Photomatics and take a look. And it has a new feature called Exposure Fusion. Exposure Fusion is basically optimized for merging formatted images such as TIFFs or JPEGs. Okay, so let's go ahead and click it, and we're going to need to tell Photomatics using Exposure Fusion where to go get the images. So I'm going to go ahead and browse, and those three images that I was using was called the car 001 through 003. So we'll select the first one and hold the shift key and select the last one. So we're going to start with three images. We can select more, especially if we have a wider range of exposure values or bracketed images. Now, each one of these images are 2 stops apart, and I'm going to tell it to align the source image, and you can choose correct by horizontal verticals or by matching features. So play with them both. I'm going to, by default, it's correct horizontal and vertical, so I'm going to select that one and click OK. And it's basically showing me that it's loading your source images, and you basically sit back and relax until it's done. There it is. It's all done, and it's merged all three images. As you can see, we have detail on our shadow areas, and as you can see, as the cursor is moving over my object, I have a marching ants square around it. If I click and release, now you get your loop will come up, and it's showing us basically, or giving us a preview of wherever this little square is sitting. So if I bring it right over here by the steering wheel and the shadows, let's go ahead and bring it on down so we can see what's going on in there, what type of detail. So we have detail. Now basically, Exposure Fusion is a simpler form of Photomatics features. We're going to go into the more sophisticated areas in just a little bit, but right now let's take a look at your presets that you have. By default, you're in highlights and shadows to adjust, which is giving you all types of options, and we'll explore those in just a minute. But let's select average. Let's click average and see what happens. It's averaging out the three exposures. You have detail in your highlights, and your shadows have details, but they're just a little bit darker than before. Let's go to highlights and shadows auto and select that. Let's watch the image, and automatically the shadows come up a little bit in tonality, where we're getting even more detail in the shadows, as you can see here. In fact, let's go over here and bring it a little bit closer to the window. There it is. A little more detail in the shadows, as well as maintain great, wonderful detail in the highlights. Let's skip over shadows and highlights for now, and let's go to highlights and shadows 2 images. Now what this is doing is allowing you to select the 2 out of however many images you have selected. So the first image and the second image is organized. The first is number 1, and of course this is number 2. If I choose to go number 3, I can select number 2, which is by default is showing you the results of those 2 images merged together. What if we go at number 3 and number 1? We'll select that, and we see the results for that. So play around with that as well. Let's go down to Highlight Shadows Intensive and select it. And Now it's kept the last settings, and I was playing around with this. And basically what I've done is I've taken the color saturation down to the left, which is turning it basically into black and white. If I bring the saturation over to the right, we should get a much more saturated image as we're seeing here. So as we start to massage tonal values, tonal information, the saturation of your color becomes sacrificed or oversaturated depending on how you're working with your image. So the color saturation allows you that range of opportunity. All right, so let's I'm gonna bring this up a little bit more so we get a little bit more color in here, and let's bring down the strength all the way down to the left, and let's see what happens to the image. There we go. So now we're getting a much more extreme range between your highlights and shadows, and if we bring it over to the right, it starts to mix in a little bit more the middle shot, which is compensating for the medium range information or the medium gray information. Remember, we have extreme highlights, shadows, and details. Okay, and of course radius allows us to fine tune all of this. So I'm bringing it over to the right a little bit, and you can see right in here we gained a little bit more sharpness, or a little more contrast. If I bring the radius all the way to the left, let's take a look at it, and you're getting a little flatter image. So play with these. And now let's go over to highlight, shadows, and adjust. This gives you a little bit more options. If we pull it over to the right, let's see what options. We start to see the highlight areas get a little bit brighter. It's starting to add more highlight. Let's go a little bit more to the right, and it's bringing more of the information from the particular exposure that's giving you a little more highlights, or bringing up the shadows a little bit, but also in effect increasing your brighter areas. And let's go ahead and bring this back to the left, and let's see what happens. Okay, now it starts to increase the darker areas. Now the blending point is basically how the two are blended together. Okay, and lower, there we go. See, it starts to bring up the blending and the luminosity. Alright, so play with these two sliders. Let's go to our shadows. In fact, let's go ahead and bring up the blending point just a little bit. Let's bring up the accentuation. There we are. And let's bring down the blending point just a little bit. There we go. That's a lot more even between your extreme ranges. Shadows simply means increase the shadow details, or decrease the shadow details. And bringing it back to the left will darken up your shadows. Bringing the shadows to the right is brightening them up. See, the higher the number to go, the brighter your shadows will become. Color saturation, of course, should be self-explanatory. As I started to mess around with the contrast or adjustment of your values, which means your black and white information, we've lost a little bit of the saturation. So if we bring the saturation up, we start to gain a little bit more rust. Your rust starts to look a lot more like as rust should. White clip. If I bring the white clip on over, and your white starts to become brighter. Now kind of watch your histogram as we're doing this. Bring it over to the left. The histogram moves slightly to the left because now we're starting to dominate with more lower tonality to mid tonality information. If I bring the white clip all the way to the right, and the histogram moves slightly to the right. Okay, but because we're exposing with the three bracketed images, a lot of that mid-tone and lower shadow detail remains mostly. Alright, and your black clip, let's go ahead and bring the white clip down a little bit so we can gain a little more detail in our highlights. The black clip, let's watch your histogram. I bring it to the right, and you have a slight movement here. Basically, it's allowing your shadows or your lower values become a little more darker in value. If I bring it over to the left, and we can see right up in this area is a very subtle adjustment within the exposure fusion. Mid-tone, bring it over to the right, and it's brightening up your mid-tone. As the higher the number becomes, the brighter the mid-tone will be. And as you can see, the highlights and the extreme shadows aren't being affected that much. If I bring the mid-tones all the way down, okay, so it's adding medium gray information. And of course the rust is looking more like rust, but that's a little bit too low, so we adjust this to taste. Bring it on up, and that looks pretty good. Now Once you're done, simply hit process. Right now, this is all in RAM. What we're seeing is in RAM. It's temporary memory. Now I want to process this to convert this to a pixel image or a rasterized image, and hit process, and fusing images with highlight and shadows, adjust. Alright, here's the final version, and all we need to do is save it out. File, save as, save it where you like. I'm going to put it within the HDR folder, and it's called the HDR001 2 and 3 fuse.tiff. Now, it's by default giving you an 8-bit TIFF, so I prefer to save it as a 16-bit TIFF. Okay, and because that 16-bit information is all there. In fact, close to 32 bits information is there, but we want 16-bit here, and you know, and I said previously, close to 32 bits information, because it is a formatted file, because we're working with TIFFs originally, 16-bit original TIFFs, it didn't have 32 bits information from the get-go. So it's only going to give you the option of 8-bit or 16-bit. If we were working in RAW, of course, all that raw information is there. It will allow us to do a 32-bit file, okay? Because we were limited according to the amount of information when anything is formatted. So while I'm going to select 16-bit, I'll keep it the same name and click save, and now we can open this up in Photoshop just fine. So if I go back to Bridge and take a look for that file, and we're going to look for the car. I think it was fused 1, 2, 3. Let's go down here to our film strip view, and let's hit the F5. All right, and the refresh, and there it is, car fused. All right, and we fused this as a result of bracketed images, 2 stops from the normal exposure, 2 stops underexposed, 2 stops overexposed, and 1 normal. This is our overexposed, that's our underexposed, and that's our normal. Okay, so I hope this has helped a little bit. Now we're going to go into the tone mapping aspects of Photomatix in our next video. So be sure to go to my website, and I'm going to go to www.chromeillusion.com. okay, and make sure you go to your tutorials, and all the tutorials are listed here, from beginning, intermediate to Wacom Pen, and of course our Photomatix tutorials will be down here in this section as well. Alright, I'm Stephen Burns. Hope you enjoyed this. Have fun.